really happy to have you here at 10:13 a.m. today, 10:13 a.m. exactly. Kids in Nashville, Tennessee all walked out of their classes. Look at that. 10:13 a.m. is when the first Help Me 911 calls started coming into the police department in Nashville 1 week ago today. Monday last week, when that horrific school shooting started unfolding at the Covenant School, an elementary school in that city. Police today said that in the roughly 14 minutes that it took for that school shooting to elapse, the shooter fired 126 rifle rounds and 26 rounds from a handgun, 152 rounds altogether in 14 minutes. To honor the 3 little kids and the 3 school staff who were murdered in their school Monday last week, and to demand legal change to stop gun violence, literally thousands of Tennessee students walked out of their classes today. And at some schools, they left their classrooms and they rallied outside their school. That happened at a whole bunch of different schools in Tennessee. At some schools today, they did a walk-in instead of a walk-out, meaning they left class, but then they came together in a school auditorium to talk about the problem. But by the thousands, what students did today in Tennessee is they went to the Tennessee State Capitol in Nashville. Look at these images. This is today. Now, you might have seen in the news last week that Thursday last week, a lot of kids in Nashville did the same. Last week, Tennessee kids crowded into the galleries overlooking the State House floor, calling for gun reforms. That was Thursday last week. Today, they rallied on the state capitol steps in Nashville. And then in huge numbers, they lined up, they went through security, and they just poured into the hallways of the state capitol, at one point mounting a kind of sit-in outside the offices of the Republican House Speaker. The same House Speaker today stripped 2 Democratic legislators of their committee assignments and threatened to expel 3 Democratic state legislatures from the state legislature altogether, threatening to throw them out of the state legislature because those 3 Democratic state legislators joined with the kids who protested from the galleries last week. Well, tonight, those kids are back at the state capitol, and joining them are apparently a bunch of parents who have their little kids in tow with them. And apparently they are planning to stay through this evening's legislative sessions in Nashville at the state capitol in Tennessee. We're keeping eyes on Nashville tonight as that story continues to unfold. Just some remarkable images today out of Tennessee. Meanwhile, today, the Republican governor of Florida made a sort of telling decision to do this behind closed doors. Today, Ron DeSantis signed new legislation for Florida, and he did it in this session that was closed to the public. Only the NRA was invited and other pro-gun lobbyists. Nobody else knew about it. But the bill that he signed there with the NRA behind closed doors will now make it legal in Florida for anybody to carry a concealed loaded weapon with no permit, no training, no background check, no license. So if you're in Florida and you're breathing, feel free to put a loaded gun in your pants and take it wherever you want. New law signed into effect today by Ron DeSantis. Interesting that Governor Ron DeSantis chose to do this signing without the public invited, without anybody even notified in advance that he was doing it. It was just him and the gun lobbyists behind closed doors. That said, that same governor, Ron DeSantis, got a political gift today from his biggest supposed political rival. Whether or not you really wanted to see the moment-by-moment O.J. Simpson style, Bronco on the freeway coverage of former President Trump leaving his house in Florida and going to the airport, and then leaving the airport in New York and going to his house in New York, whether or not you wanted to see the moment-by-moment motorcade coverage of that today, tracking the progress of him like he's Santa, and we're all NORAD, tracking the progress of him today so we can see him leave Florida and go to New York so he can be arraigned tomorrow, whether or not you really wanted to see that moment-by-moment coverage today. The fact is that Donald Trump did leave his house in Florida today in order to be on time for his arraignment at court in New York tomorrow. And again, however excited you were to see the coverage or not, one thing that means, at least one thing that appears to mean for sure, is that former President Trump is apparently not going to hide out in Florida and refuse to surrender himself for arraignment. Now, I say this is a gift, a political gift to Florida Republican Governor Ron DeSantis, because you may recall that last week, Governor DeSantis got up on his proverbial hind legs and said, as Florida's governor, he would refuse to participate in any extradition proceedings to get Trump from Florida to New York. That remarkable statement from Florida Governor Ron DeSantis last week actually raised the prospect that Trump might refuse to turn himself in, that he might try to, barricade himself, somehow stay in Florida and initiate some kind of standoff where he's daring law enforcement to come get him at his Florida home, while Florida's governor tells Florida law enforcement not to help arrest Trump. Nobody quite knew how that would go if Trump actually tried to pull that off, especially because that's a fantastically unconstitutional thing for Ron DeSantis to have pledged to do on Trump's behalf. But Trump saved him from having to put his money where his mouth is. Trump today saved Ron DeSantis from having to show what he actually meant by that, when today he flew his big plane from Florida to New York, conceding in effect that he will be arrested tomorrow and he will not fight it. So the Florida law enforcement standoff over Trump being extradited, that's not going to happen, which is good news for the country. I mean, the prospect of that happening taught us that Florida's Republican governor is happy to promise to defy the Constitution in order to help Trump. That's good to know. He said that he would do it. We have to assume that he would try it. But in the end, today we learned he wouldn't have to prove it. The other thing that appears to be sort of happening now, the other unknown at the start of this process that is now becoming known, is what had been a very open question as to how Trump supporters would respond to the arrest and indictment of the former president. You might remember what Trump first said when he announced to the country that he believed he would be indicted and arrested. Do you remember what his first statement was? He had a declarative demand to his supporters. He said, protest, take our nation back. We must save America. Protest, protest, protest. You know what didn't happen? That didn't happen. And that was a couple of weeks ago now when Trump first said that he would be arrested. He demanded that his supporters get out in the streets, that they protest in response to the threat to arrest him. That did not happen. Nobody protested. And you could say, okay, maybe that's because Trump was wrong about when he was going to be indicted, when he was going to be arrested. He wasn't, in fact, arrested that Tuesday when he said he was going to be. So maybe that's why the protests didn't emerge. Well, that day that he said he was going to be arrested, in fact, passed without him being indicted or arrested. But then last week, the day happened. We learned late in the day on Thursday that Trump had been indicted. And Trump's lawyers confirmed that he had been indicted. And then the DA's office in New York confirmed that he had been indicted. And then we learned that tomorrow, Tuesday, he will be arrested. He will be arraigned. But still, nobody really protested. I mean, a handful of people showed up and waved flags or whatever at Mar-a-Lago, but it wasn't anything that constituted an event by any stretch of the imagination. I mean, we've had headline after headline after headline after headline saying that everybody is bracing for mass protest by Trump supporters. But it's not happening. At least thus far, it's not happening. And that itself is an interesting political fact now. That's an interesting political known outcome here. I mean, he specifically called on his supporters to come out and protest on his behalf, to save America, to protest, protest, protest. The New York Times specifically reporting over the weekend on a planned New York City homecoming protest on Trump's behalf at Trump Tower this morning, Monday morning in New York City. Well, whatever the New York Times was expecting in terms of the Trump homecoming protest at Trump Tower, it was like 3 people. I mean, this was the headline in Politico yesterday. Lone MAGA supporter awaits Trump in New York. And that's not hyperbole. That whole story was basically a profile on the one guy, the single guy who turned up at Trump Tower to support Trump yesterday. And then today, the big homecoming protest in support of Donald Trump. This was the headline at New York Magazine today. Trump supporters in Manhattan are outnumbered by reporters. Here's the lead of that story. Quote, one South Brooklyn resident who sells MAGA merchandise and medical software for a living had organized a homecoming for the former president ahead of his arraignment tomorrow. The man was hoping for a strong turnout. Roger Stone, after all, had amplified his rally announcement. But just a handful of supporters actually showed up. I mean, it's one thing for people to not come out and protest in support of you, right? It's one thing for people to not come out and protest in your defense. But when you specifically ask them to, when you in fact command them to, and they don't, what does that say about you? I mean, Trump last year said if any prosecutor indicted him, the United States would have, quote, the biggest protest we have ever had. He said in Washington, D.C., in New York, in Atlanta, and elsewhere, we are going to have in this country the biggest protest we have ever had. He said in January last year that would be the result of any indictment of him in any of those jurisdictions. In September, he said it again. He was asked if he'd be indicted. He said in response, I think if it happened, I think you'd have problems in this country, the like of which perhaps we've never seen before. I don't think the people of the United States would stand for it. Now we know the people of the United States are standing for it, it turns out. And, we'll see what tomorrow's like. We will see whether there is a, massive millions of people fill the streets, pro-Trump protest on the streets of Manhattan tomorrow. Maybe there will be. Who knows? But he asked people to protest in response to news of his indictment. And so far, his requests, his demands, his certain predictions that Americans would turn to the streets in record numbers on his behalf, numbers never seen before, people protesting against his indictment and protests like we've never seen before in America. So far, his people are not doing what he told them to do and what he confidently said they would do. But who knows? Who knows? We'll see what happens tomorrow. And like we have been reporting on this show, like I have been trying to sort of convey in terms of my perception about how this is going to go, there's still lots to come. I mean, this is the start of a legal process, which, if it goes terribly for him, will likely end with him, being fined for something that his lawyer already went to prison for. It's going to take a long time. New York court proceedings always take a long time. New York court proceedings in white-collar crime brought by very litigious guys often take forever. It's going to take a long time. And even in the short term, it's going to be a lot of motions. It's going to be a lot of legalese. And it's actually going to be mixed up with a lot of other legal processes. I mean, here we are at the beginning of April. What's Trump's month going to look like? Right? This week, he's in New York to be arraigned and arrested tomorrow. Next week, he has to be in New York again to be deposed in the $250 million civil fraud suit that the New York Attorney General has brought against him and his adult children. The week after that is when the Fox Dominion case is supposed to go to trial. If the disclosures thus far in that trial are anything to go by, that will mean, among other things, lots more headlines about the most influential right-wing media figures in the country secretly hating Trump's guts and telling people behind the scenes when nobody's watching how dumb and terrible and wrong Trump is. That'll be a nice week for him. Then the week after that, the E. Jean Carroll case goes to trial, in which he's accused of raping E. Jean Carroll and then lying about it. I mean, that's what April looks like in his calendar. That's what the next 4 weeks are like for him in his calendar. So who knows? Maybe one of those things will be a flashpoint. Maybe at some point this month, 1 million Americans will flood the streets of New York, cheering his name and burning cars or something. But so far, there's no sign of anything like that, despite his confident predictions that that's what his supporters would do. When he does get arraigned tomorrow, mid-afternoon, his indictment will be unsealed by the judge who is overseeing his case. You should know that that judge is also the same judge who's overseeing the Steve Bannon criminal fraud case. That is also the same judge who just oversaw the Trump business criminal fraud case, Trump organization criminal fraud case, which ended a few months ago with convictions on all counts. The judge having a hand in both of those things is a good reminder that Trump's indictment doesn't exactly come out of the blue here. His business was just convicted on multiple felony fraud counts. His accountant is a convicted felon who right now is in prison. His campaign chairman is a convicted felon. His deputy campaign chairman is a convicted felon. His longest-term political advisor is a convicted felon. His campaign CEO and top White House advisor is right now under felony indictment before the same judge that Trump's about to get arraigned before. His national security advisor is a convicted felon. His personal lawyer is a convicted felon who, in fact, went to federal prison for the criminal scheme that we believe Trump himself is about to finally be charged for tomorrow. It's not like this came out of the blue. And while we're on the subject of this judge, you should know that the judge who's going to be handling this Trump case not only handled the Trump business fraud case and is not only currently handling the Steve Bannon fraud case. This judge also has the perfect resume for this case in particular, because before he became a judge, do you know what his previous job was? His previous job before he became a judge was working as an auditor at a real estate development firm. It is believed that these charges against Trump are about falsification of business records at Trump's real estate development firm. It is a little bit on the nose that falsification of business records at a real estate development firm is a case that's going to be heard before a judge who used to audit business records at a real estate development firm, but that's the way this thing is going. That's the way this month is going for Donald Trump. It's like this case was put together in a lab. But there's a lot going on. Yes, that arraignment and arrest of the former president will happen tomorrow in New York. Simultaneously, for what it's worth, Finland will also be joining NATO tomorrow, which means if Russia invaded Ukraine as some sort of message that Vladimir Putin was going to push back NATO, well, what he's actually reaping from his Ukraine invasion is the opposite of that. When Finland joins NATO tomorrow, the length of the border between Russia and NATO will double. Also tomorrow, we're going to have a hugely important election in the great American state of Wisconsin, the most important, likely the most consequential election in the whole United States for all of 2023. We're going to have more on that coming up in just a moment. Plus tonight here on this show, we've got news tonight. We've got ugly follow-up news on a white power Nazi rally that happened a couple of weeks ago in Ohio, which we covered here on the show. We got a really strong reaction from you guys, from the viewers, to the footage that we aired of that Nazi rally in Ohio a couple of weeks ago. Well, we've got follow-up news on that tonight. The FBI has now arrested one of the professed Nazis from that rally after he allegedly firebombed a church in Ohio. We've got that story ahead as well. We've got eyes tonight on Nashville. We got lots to get to tonight. Stay with us.
Hey, everybody, it's Savannah Guthrie.
And I'm Hoda Kotb, and we've got some great news to share.
The Today Show is now available wherever you get your podcasts.
Can you believe that? Right now, you can get your daily dose of news and headlines and the day's top interviews from us right here every single morning.
We have what you need to start your day, and it's available every day, wherever you get your podcasts.
So why not subscribe and follow today to start listening?
CNBC's Last Call podcast. Get the stories behind the numbers.
There's investing news that impacts your money and your portfolio.
And the people behind the business.
And there's business news that impacts your life.
From Wall Street to K Street and Main Street. The markets may close. Your money never stops.
Last Call is really about spotting tomorrow's opportunities tonight.
Brian Sullivan hosts Last Call. Follow and listen to CNBC's Last Call on your favorite podcast platform today.
Handy rule for watching the news. It was true then, it's true now. I think it has eternal value. If you're a longtime watcher of this show, you will know what the rule is, which is watch what they do, not what they say. And in today's news, we have an excellent example of why that rule is important. As he approaches his arrest and indictment tomorrow, former President Donald Trump has reportedly told associates that he welcomes the spectacle of what's going to happen tomorrow. Specifically, he welcomes the idea of being paraded in front of the cameras for his arraignment. He has reportedly described the proceeding as having the potential to be a, quote, fun experience for him. The New York Times reporting that he has mused aloud about whether or not he should smile for the cameras, smile for his mugshot. His allies are also saying this indictment, this arrest is going to be a big boost for him. It will be great for his campaign. They can't wait to use the footage in all sorts of politically advantageous ways. If you go by what they say, Trump is celebrating his forthcoming arraignment, looking forward to it all being on camera because that will all be so good for him. That's what they've been saying. Well, what are they doing? What they're doing is formally arguing to the judge against cameras being allowed in the courtroom for the arraignment. Trump's lawyers are also now publicly arguing against Trump having to pose for a mugshot. Hey, wait, I thought you were excited about the mugshot. I thought you were excited for the cameras showing the arraignment. That's what they've been saying, but that's completely opposite to what they're doing. Tonight, as we speak, we are awaiting a decision by the judge in Trump's case as to whether or not he will grant a request by media organizations to allow cameras in the courtroom for the arraignment tomorrow. Again, Trump's lawyers are arguing to the judge that cameras should not be allowed. The judge is also due to decide whether to grant media organizations' request to unseal the indictment before the arraignment, before Trump appears in court tomorrow. That said, at this point, it's less than 24 hours away, so we're getting close to that being moot, but it's always conceivable that the judge could decide to unseal the indictment ahead of that 2:15 p.m. arraignment tomorrow. We will be watching. Here's one other thing to watch, though. In addition to those media access issues, the question of cameras and a mugshot and when we get to see the indictment and all that, in addition to all that stuff that is currently being litigated and decided by the judge, the other issue that may end up getting quickly litigated is the question of a potential gag order. Trump has issued a barrage of arguably threatening statements concerning both the judge in the case and the Manhattan District Attorney, the prosecutor in this case. Now, threatening a judge, threatening prosecutors, that can potentially be legally actionable at a bunch of different levels. But the first level at which we might see action in response to something like that could conceivably be a gag order. There can be, in cases like this, there can be a court order issued by the judge that limits and restricts the kind of public statements that Trump could make about the case. Now, we have not seen anything about that emerge thus far, but given the public statements that Trump has already made about the judge and about the prosecutor in this case, we'll see if that is one of the early matters that gets litigated as part of what was likely to be a sprawling legal case. Throughout, though, keep that rule in mind. Watch what they do, not what they say. Joining us now is Catherine Christian. She's a former special assistant district attorney in the Manhattan DA's office. Ms. Christian, it's a real pleasure to have you back with us. Thank you so much for being here.
Happy to be here.
First, let me ask you, like I did the last time you were here, if I've said anything that strikes you as wrong or out of order or putting the wrong emphasis on what you're expecting for tomorrow.
Not wrong at all. And in terms of the gag order, I do not think that the judge will be issuing one tomorrow, but he might give a little stern lecture to Mr. Trump and his attorneys. It's all out there what he's been saying and has said. I think his attorneys have been a little bit more circumspect when they've been speaking, so there might be a warning. I can't remember, and I've talked to colleagues and even judges, when that has happened, at least in Manhattan on a criminal case. None of us can remember, so it would be extraordinary. So I do not think Judge Merchan will be doing that tomorrow.
So just to be clear, there, in criminal cases that you're aware of and talking to colleagues who've been involved,
we've never heard of it, but we've never
okay.
had a defendant like Mr. Trump before. And there's social media, so we haven't had those issues before.
And if the data set is zero in terms of thinking about what this has been like in the past and what the kind of threshold would be for something like this, then there's nothing to extrapolate from. It's all the more reason to sort of watch this carefully and keep an open mind as to how it can go. What do you think the public at large, all of us non-lawyers out here who are watching this as a news event and in terms of sort of American history and American politics, what should we expect to see at the arraignment? What should we expect in terms of newsworthy developments, if any? Can you just walk us through what tomorrow's likely to be like?
I think in the courtroom, which should be, is very different than what will be happening outside the courtroom and what Mr. Trump will be saying once he leaves and goes back to Florida and gives his public statements. It should be like an ordinary proceeding, an ordinary Supreme Court arraignment. Granted, it involves Mr. Trump, and there's going to be lots of security, outside the courthouse and inside the courtroom. The court clerk will call the case into the record, the people of the state of New York versus Donald Trump, give out the indictment number. The prosecution on the other side will file and serve a copy of the indictment. So when they serve a copy on whether it's Mr. Tacopina or one of the other attorneys, that will be the first time they will be made aware of all of the charges against Mr. Trump. And the judge will arraign Mr. Trump on the indictment like any other defendant. That happens on a daily basis in that courthouse. And then this could be the wild card. 99.9% of defendants say absolutely nothing other than not guilty at their arraignment. The attorneys speak on their behalf. I would anticipate Mr. Trump won't speak in the well of the courtroom. Everything he will say will probably be outside the well of the courtroom. But that could be the surprise if he does speak. His lawyers will argue on his behalf. They either will repeat what they've been saying, what Mr. Tacopina has been saying, throughout the weekend. I've seen him on the news talk about how this is an unjust, prosecution. It's a persecution, whatever. And then he will ask for an adjournment for motions, or the judge will say, or you'll be filing motions and then give an adjourned date. And then the people, that's the term that prosecutors are called in New York State, the people. Then the prosecution the date will be set. There will be a date for the prosecution to respond to those motions, and then a date will be set for a decision on those motions. So that's the regular procedure for every other Supreme Court arraignment in New York, and I expect it to be the same. The wild card will be what will be coming out the mouth of the attorneys on the side of the defense.
One of the things that, again, those of us non-lawyers who have had to become amateur lawyers to follow the various scandals of the Trump administration while the former president was in office, and there were so many court cases associated with so many of his associates and political associates. One of the things that we came to sort of appreciate was the idea of a speaking indictment. Sometimes when there is an indictment, prosecutors write it in such a way that it's kind of meant for a lay audience, it feels, at least goes out of its way to put in context the charges so that people understand the overall criminal scheme that's being alleged, and that tells it in a way that helps people sort of contextualize it and understand it, as opposed to just a dry recitation of the statutes and the evidence in a way that doesn't necessarily speak to non-lawyers. Does the DA's office have a pattern around those sort of things? Do they use speaking indictments at the New York level? Does the DA's office, in your mind, have a sort of standard to meet in terms of how much this is going to make sense to the non-lawyers among us, or how much it'll be a technical document?
Yes, absolutely, particularly on a complex case like this. Complex if it's true that there's 30 counts. And I understand that Mr. Bragg, District Attorney Bragg, is going to be giving a press conference at about 3:30. So what a perfect way to give a press conference than actually have a copy of the indictment that will be distributed to the press, and they will have the facts that are in the indictment there. And it's a good way, typically an indictment just lists the charge, the date when the crime allegedly occurred, and the elements of the charge. A speaking indictment is exactly how you defined it. You're much more detailed about the facts, every count. There may even be a preamble at the beginning of the indictment to sort of outline what's going on, at least their theory of this case against Mr. Trump. And I expect that will happen. I have no clue what the 30 counts are, but I do expect it'll be a speaking indictment. and it'll be accompanied by a press release. And of course, Mr. Bragg will be having a press conference.
Catherine Christian is a former special assistant DA in the Manhattan DA's office. And again, she is absolutely right that Alvin Bragg, the Manhattan DA, is expected to give a press conference tomorrow after this arraignment in mid-afternoon. Catherine, it's really great to see you here again tonight. Thank you so much for your time.
Great being here. Thank you, Rachel.
All right, more ahead here tonight. Stay with us.
This is Chris Hayes from MSNBC. The Manhattan grand jury voted to indict Donald Trump, setting a new precedent for holding American leaders accountable. But how do you convince a jury to convict a former president? On MSNBC's new podcast, Prosecuting Donald Trump, MSNBC legal contributors Andrew Weissman and Mary McCord, two of the most well-respected prosecutors in the country, break down what's next from a prosecutor's perspective. Search for Prosecuting Donald Trump wherever you're listening right now and follow.
Hey everyone, it's Tremaine Lee, MSNBC correspondent and host of the podcast Into America. A train derailment and chemical spill in East Palestine, Ohio, caused panic and anger among residents and triggered a big response from the EPA. But for people who live in so-called sacrifice zones, especially in Black communities, environmental issues like this are a way of life.
So when you live in a sacrifice zone, you're basically being poisoned every day. So it becomes an intergenerational cycle of poison and poor public health.
Listen now and follow wherever you get your podcasts.
The great state of Wisconsin has broken several important world records in its history as a state. Wisconsin, perhaps unsurprisingly, holds the record for the world's largest cheese board. Of course they do. Wisconsin also holds the record for the world's oldest groom. A Wisconsin man named Harry Stevens got married at the age of 103. Mazel tov. His parents must have been so proud. But now Wisconsin has another record to add to its list, the most expensive judicial election in American history. Tomorrow, Wisconsin voters will vote for who should fill an open seat on the state's Supreme Court. And the amount of money spent in that race so far is about $45 million. Now, for context, the average amount of money raised by a U.S. Senate candidate in last year's elections was about $13 million. This judicial race in Wisconsin is at $45 million and counting, more than triple the average cost of a Senate seat. The reason this state Supreme Court race has attracted that gobsmacking amount of money is because so much is on the line. I mean, which of these two candidates gets this seat on the state Supreme Court will almost certainly determine whether or not Wisconsin's abortion ban is upheld, now that the U.S. Supreme Court has overturned Roe. Wisconsin's also possibly the most aggressively gerrymandered state in the country. The state has an electorate that's basically 50-50 between Democrats and Republicans in terms of voters. But Republicans have given themselves such aggressively drawn maps that even when Wisconsin voters vote 50-50 Democrat-Republican, or even when more Wisconsinites vote for Democrats than Republicans, Republicans still win a huge majority of the congressional races and the seats in the state legislature. The state Supreme Court could make all the difference along those lines, too, which could affect the partisan control of the United States House. It's also worth remembering that during the 2020 presidential election, there was precisely one state Supreme Court in the whole country, the Wisconsin State Supreme Court, that took up a Trump lawsuit trying to overturn the election results in that state. Wisconsin was the one state Supreme Court that took up one of those cases. And it was only by one vote that the Wisconsin Supreme Court decided that they would reject Trump's demand to throw out hundreds of thousands of votes from the two biggest Democratic cities in the state, which would have flipped the election result and made Trump the winner. Only one vote on the state Supreme Court, or they would have thrown out the election results and made Trump the winner instead. I should also let you know that of the two candidates who are running for this open seat on the state Supreme Court tomorrow, the more conservative of the two candidates is the lawyer who advised the state Republican Party on the plan to send fake electors to Washington to pretend that Trump had won Wisconsin when he had not. Whatever happens in this election tomorrow will have major implications, not just for Wisconsin, but for the entire country. Political observers around the country are calling this the most important election in the whole country for all of this year. Joining us now is Ben Wickler. He's chair of the Wisconsin Democratic Party, which has been working its proverbial butt off on behalf of the more liberal of the two candidates who's on the ballot tomorrow. Ben, it's nice to see you. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks so much, Rachel.
So I'm personally uncomfortable with the whole idea of judges as elected anyway. I have to say that as a baseline matter, but that is where we are. And this is absolutely a totally hard fought, all out election tomorrow. What kind of resources have you and other Democrats put into this race? And what are you expecting to be the results of your labor?
So this election is the hinge in the political history of Wisconsin. We're a state that used to be proudly purple, but also a progressive bastion. And when Republicans swept into power on the backs of Citizen United in 2010, they rigged the state, smashed unions, made us one of the hardest states in the country to vote, the fourth hardest. We're number 47 out of 50 in terms of the ease of casting a ballot. We have the most aggressive partisan gerrymander. We have the dubious distinction of, as you said, coming closest to overturning the last election. And the Supreme Court is the backstop for all of that. Our gerrymandered maps aren't the result of a Republican governor working with a Republican legislature. They were put in place by our state Supreme Court, which chose them along partisan lines. Because in Wisconsin and across the country, Republicans decided a generation ago to treat courts as a political battleground. And as Democrats, I think a lot of us were kind of late to the party on this, but now we are fighting with everything we've got because everything's on the line. So we've been able to raise and support Janet Protasiewicz, the great, more progressive candidate who is reasonable, common sense, prosecutor, judge in Milwaukee, to the tune of millions of dollars. Republicans have poured in essentially an equal number of millions of dollars, all through dark money, undisclosed, far right-wing groups that are running Willie Horton ads, literally shot-by-shot remakes of the Willie Horton ad, to try to smear her and terrify people into voting against their own freedom and their own democracy. And tomorrow, we'll find out. These races can come down to microscopic margins. In the 2019 Supreme Court race here, it came down to less than 0.5% of the vote. Tomorrow, if we win by 10 votes, I will be thrilled. My hope is, and my belief is, it'll be more than that because the wind is at our backs. But anything can happen in Wisconsin. And anyone who hasn't voted yet and is watching should cast a vote early tomorrow because the weather will be bad and we cannot leave anything to chance.
Ben, I feel like a lot of the national discussion that I've read, a lot of the national sort of explainers about this race, reporters trying to say why it's so important, have talked about this race between Daniel Kelly, the more conservative candidate, and Judge Protasiewicz, the more progressive candidate, and have described Judge Protasiewicz as being very much at an advantage in terms of spending, saying that she has greatly outspent Dan Kelly on the way to Election Day tomorrow. But you're saying that if you count the dark money expenditures on Kelly's behalf, it's a much more even race in terms of the amount of expenditure?
That's right. So in Wisconsin, the state parties are allowed to transfer funds to the candidate's campaign. And I'm proud that at the Democratic Party of Wisconsin, folks have gone to wisdems.org. They've shipped in. We've been able to transfer millions of dollars to her account. The Republican Party, although they paid him directly as their election integrity advisor, they have not done these big contributions, maybe because to contribute to a political party, you have to disclose your identity. So almost all the spending, I think almost all of the TV ads have been funded by dark money groups, many of them groups that are doing so-called issue advertising. They have to pay higher rates for their ads. So people have seen more of our ads. On the other hand, there are 81 stations on the radio in Wisconsin that play right-wing talk radio. Those have been doing round-the-clock voter mobilization. The whole right-wing machine is up in arms on this thing. Right now, Dan Kelly is flying around Wisconsin on a private jet lent to him by anti-abortion radical activists who happen to have a giant fortune that they're sitting on. It's a kind of full court press on the right. It just doesn't stack up in the same way in the public disclosures of campaign finance filings from the campaigns themselves. So make no mistake, the other side, they're outspending us in the final week. We're using our money more efficiently because folks are making contributions that are actually subject to disclosure. But this could be close. I think we have a real shot at winning this, but I want everyone to realize that in Wisconsin elections, if it goes above 1 percentage point in the margin, That's a landslide. 4 of the last 6 presidential races here have come down to less than 1 percentage point. And the wind is at our backs because the message about reproductive freedom, about gerrymandering, that we just want fair maps, we don't want to tilt them one way or the other, and about preventing Republicans from overturning the 2024 presidential race. Those messages are dynamite. But the other side is using fear tactics, the fear of crime, usually using images of Black men who have committed crimes to try to terrify viewers of these television ads. And they want people to forget about the stakes for themselves and their own lives. The ads on the right, some of them have been taken down because they were totally mischaracterizing things that happened in the courtroom. But they don't care. What they want is an electorate that is fearful, that is divided, and that ultimately votes for someone who could take away the power of voters themselves to choose who represents them in government. That's not a prospect that any of us should be comfortable living with. And it is all systems go to turn out every possible voter tomorrow, starting at 7 a.m. when the polls open and going through until the last second when the polls close at 8 p.m.
Ben Wickler is chair of the Wisconsin Democratic Party. Ben, keep us apprised tomorrow. The whole country is going to be watching how this goes. Thank you.
Thanks so much.
All right, we'll be right back. Stay with us. I want to update you on an unsettling story we covered a few weeks ago here on the show. You might remember some of this footage that we showed. We heard from a lot of you about it. It's footage from a neo-Nazi rally targeting trans people and drag performance in Ohio. And I'm not using the phrase neo-Nazi here as some sort of generic epithet. I mean, that is specifically what we are dealing with here.
Why more condition?
So we showed you this video on the show a few weeks ago. Protesters, including dozens of neo-Nazis, some of them conspicuously armed. They're carrying swastika flags. They're shouting Sieg Heil. They were screaming at a drag queen story hour, a family-friendly event that was being held in Wadsworth, Ohio. Well, now, here's an update. This photo is from a newly released federal criminal complaint. This complaint identifies a 20-year-old man, you see at the center of this image, as a member of the Ohio chapter of White Lives Matter. This photo shows him at that anti-trans protest that we covered last month. On Friday, this man was arrested and charged in federal court for allegedly trying to firebomb an Ohio church. He is currently in federal custody. According to the FBI and the Justice Department, the man drove to a church more than an hour from his home. He brought with him these Molotov cocktails and a spray bottle filled with gasoline. He then firebombed the church. The church was marked with scorch marks. The FBI says they were able to link him to the attack by tracing the location of his cell phone. According to the criminal complaint in his case, when FBI agents arrived at his home, he admitted to building the Molotov cocktails and to throwing them at the church. They said he told them the reason he did it was to stop a drag show event that was scheduled for the following week at the church. He told them his only regret was that the Molotov cocktails didn't cause more damage. There was nobody inside the church at the time that he attacked it. Nobody was hurt, but you can see there was some damage. The church says they would like to see this young man prosecuted to send a message to other like-minded people. But the church also says they forgive him for what he did. In the end, the church was able to hold that drag story event that they had planned for this past weekend as originally planned. There was a protest about 15 minutes down the road at a related drag event in a neighboring town. This one was targeted by a white nationalist group called the Patriot Front. That's them across the street there near the gazebo, you can see. The ultra-right, the violent ultra-right, including the neo-Nazi movement in this country, is, for whatever reason, extremely energized right now. And yeah, we talk a lot about how the very far right, how extremists are connected to electoral politics and the like. But these federal charges for trying to firebomb a church over a drag story hour, it really puts an exclamation point on the rise of right-wing extremism and right-wing violence just on its own terms, regardless of what it's connected to. Again, he's been charged in federal court. He's in custody right now. We'll know more later this week when he has his first day in court. Stay with us. As you may have heard, tomorrow in New York City, a man from Queens is due to be arrested and then arraigned in Manhattan criminal court. News organizations, including NBC News, asked the judge in this case to allow cameras in the courtroom for the arraignment. Lawyers for soon-to-be defendant Donald Trump argued against having cameras there, claiming it would create a circus-like atmosphere, and you know how much their client hates that. Well, tonight, since we have been on the air, the judge has just issued a ruling in this case. I'll tell you exactly what the ruling says. I'm just reviewing it at my desk right now. 5 pool photographers shall be permitted into the jury box prior to the commencement of the arraignment. The photographers will be permitted to take still photos for several minutes until such time as they're directed to vacate the jury box by court personnel. No further photography will be permitted in the courtroom after that. Use of cameras will be permitted in the hallways of the building. So again, cameras will be allowed in the hallways, but not in the courtroom itself once things get underway. The judge also says reporters will be able to bring cell phones and laptops inside the court, but they cannot use them once they are in there. And again, as described in the ruling that I just read to you, still photos will be allowed up until the proceedings begin, and then court personnel will tell photographers that they can no longer use their cameras. I should tell you that we will have special team coverage of tomorrow's historic event here on MSNBC starting at 8 p.m. Eastern. I will be part of that team coverage. I will see you tomorrow night right here, again starting at 8 p.m. Deep breath, everybody. Here we go.